So I think this is fundamental. We do everything ourselves. If we suck somewhere, it's on us. Nobody else to blame. But if it's a success, it's the success of the people and the team.
But this was one of the most memorable gaming experiences I've ever had.
Cyberpunk 2077 is not the game we thought we were getting. It's good in many ways, but it's also lacking in just as many, if not more ways. I've actually been playing the game a lot on Xbox Series X, PS5, and PC, and to be honest, I'm actually enjoying it a lot. At least on PC, where it's, playable. And I'll tell you what, I've played the crap out of it. I've seen every ending that the game has to offer, and after all of that, I can say that there's a lot this game does well, and a lot that it does poorly. That being said, I think Cyberpunk 2077 is a lot closer to The Witcher 3 than people are willing to admit, and we're going to discuss that in this video. Now, like I said, I'm enjoying the game mostly on PC. I've played it on PS5 and on Series X, and to be honest, I think the game is lacking on those platforms, even though they're next generation, or I guess now current generation platforms. And yes, this is even after the latest 1.1 patch, when they claim to have fixed many, many issues. In fact, it's kind of crazy. I had never experienced a hard PC crash in my entire time with Cyberpunk 2077 until we were playing it on stream the day they launched that patch, and we had two separate complete crashes where the game caused not just the game to close, but the entire PC to shut down and do a forced restart. It's absolutely insane. Did we just crash? I'm not joking. It just fully shut off the PC. But beyond potentially damaging your PC hardware, a few major issues that I do have with the game more broadly are things such as inventory management and UI. It's all a complete mess. It seems as though it wasn't thought through at all and is still in the early alpha phase. The world is bland, and there's a real lack of narrative consequence, something we can't really delve into here, but something we'll discuss in the critique. There's questing issues, a lack of depth in the crafting system, multiple game mechanics that are completely glossed over, and some which are buried beneath body modifications that are so expensive that well over 95% of players will never, ever see them, much less use them. And all of this has made me think, was The Witcher 3 just an accident? You know what I mean. If The Witcher 3 was so great, how is it possible that Cyberpunk 2077 has fallen so incredibly flat? You see, I love The Witcher 3. It has its issues, sure, and I discussed those in my critique of the game, but broadly, it's great. The world's expansive, the characters are interesting, the game is relatively well balanced, at least when you're playing on higher difficulties. And it has a game world that is among the most immersive I've ever experienced. So once I started to really think about this, I had to ask the question, was The Witcher 3 that different from Cyberpunk? And if so, what happened that made CD Projekt Red forget all of the things that made The Witcher 3 so fantastic? To do this, I pulled out a notebook and I wrote down 3 basic columns that I was going to break down: the world design, the gameplay, and the narrative. To start with the world. In The Witcher 3, the world is open. It's big, and it even has dynamic enemy encounters. So as you explore different areas, you'll encounter enemies that spawn randomly based on where you are and what's going on at that current time of the day-night cycle. But on a percentage basis, the map is largely empty. It works though, because it's mostly forests and landscapes, etc. When you're exploring farmland, it's pretty excusable to have large stretches of the map which don't have anybody in them, which are just filled with tall grass blowing in the wind. And it also has the added effect of allowing the player to become more immersed because that section of the map is fulfilling its purpose within the world. It's farmland. It should look like it's part of a farm, and it should behave in the same way and be treated the same way by the characters within that world. This is why these big open spaces are so commonly used in games, whether you look at Red Dead Redemption 2, Skyrim, or even The Witcher 3. However, that doesn't work in Night City, because every cranny is supposed to be crammed with people. If we're talking about whether or not a space on the map is fulfilling its purpose within the world, most spaces in Cyberpunk's world of Night City are failing miserably. Skyscrapers, which are supposed to be the hubs of enterprise and corporatism within the world, are empty. In many cases, they're literally hollow. No characters going in or out, NPCs walking by as though nothing is going on inside because, well, nothing is. The only time you feel as though a section of the map is actually doing its job is when you're exploring a dump, a vast expanse of desert, or a rundown alleyway where a bunch of thugs are hanging out. Almost every other space in the game world feels as though it is purely set dressing. It doesn't serve any functional purpose to the characters within the world. And it feels that way because that's what it is. Set dressing. I know it sounds overly simplistic, but in The Witcher 3, if you have an empty hunting lodge in the middle of nowhere that you can explore and loot, it makes sense in the world because chances are whoever owns that hunting cabin wouldn't be there all the time, and it would be okay for it to be found empty. It's justifiable in the world, and it's still serving its purpose within it. But to explore an urban street within Night City that's supposed to be teeming with life and find nothing there other than NPCs which are misbehaving and acting in a way which pulls the player out of their immersive state at every step of the way, it just feels as though it was designed with the same philosophy, but the setting of the world doesn't allow it to work. Again, it sounds too simple, but it really is that simple. Night City and White Orchard are different places and they need to be designed differently. But for some reason, CD Projekt Red designed them in the same way, expecting it to be treated and interacted with in the same way. But that brings us to gameplay. This was actually the most highly criticized piece of The Witcher 3 at launch. Normal difficulty doesn't need crafting, oils, or frankly, upgraded potions or gear at all. Trust me, I tried. I went through an entire run through on normal without upgrading any potions and using only weapons I looted off of enemies, and I got through just fine. In my opinion, Death March in The Witcher 3 is basically a must. Otherwise, you're never pushed to engage with all of the mechanics. And maybe this is by design, but it doesn't change the fact that if you really want to engage with and appreciate the game design within The Witcher 3, you need to try it on the highest difficulty setting. Trust me, you won't be sorry. Now, it's actually pretty similar with Cyberpunk 2077, and I'm actually okay with this. I really like the gunplay in Cyberpunk. I think there are some things that could have been done differently, such as improved movement, the ability to slide cancel, and things like that are pretty common in first-person shooters, but all told, I'm pretty happy with the combat. The only difference I would say is that in The Witcher 3, if you crank the difficulty, it actually feels as though you're engaging with the world on a more realistic level, whereas in Cyberpunk, it just turns most enemies into bullet sponges, which is an unfortunate reality of gun-based gameplay, so I'm willing to forgive it. I think it's just inevitable if you're allowing there to be multiple difficulty options. The point is, I think the gameplay is actually fairly similar in terms of quality. Playing on normal in Cyberpunk, you pretty much never need to bother with crafting or upgrading your weapons within the crafting menu. You can just go through the game playing with the normal weapons that you'll find off bodies that you are killing as you go along the way. And just like The Witcher 3, if you want to be pushed into trying every facet of the gameplay loop, play Cyberpunk 2077 on the harder difficulties, and you'll need to. But all of this brings us to the narrative, the last of the three categories. Now, I need to make something very, very clear as we discuss this. The Witcher 3 is not a narrative RPG. It's a fantastic action and adventure RPG, but the story isn't built off of your choices. Sure, the ending can change, but it's a game that's telling broadly one story. It's a great story, but not one that you create. When you compare it to something like Baldur's Gate 3 or Divinity Original Sin 2 or even Disco Elysium, it's a fundamentally different game. Now again, I love The Witcher 3's story, I really like Cyberpunk 2077's story, at least in the main campaign. I think it doesn't make a lot of sense for this type of game because it forces the player to rush through the main story if they're immersed whatsoever, bypassing all side content until they've gotten through the main story, but that's beside the point. What I'm trying to say is that these are both broadly linear experiences which diverge at the very end with a few endings based on the choices you make at the end of the game. These are not branching narrative RPGs. They're, for the most part, linear stories that have role-playing elements within the gameplay. And that's about it. So what does all of this tell us? Well, to me, it says something pretty obvious and simple. Cyberpunk is just like The Witcher 3. It's just got a cyberpunk coat of paint on it. There's a combination of reasons as to why this didn't work for Cyberpunk 2077, whereas it worked for The Witcher 3. For one, I think the setting of The Witcher 3 suits itself better to that design, which is why it worked so well, but also why it fails so spectacularly in Cyberpunk 2077. But I think perhaps the more obvious explanation is just that people expected something different. It was hyped into this bizarre Grand Theft Auto meets The Witcher 3 meets Skyrim meets Fallout amorphous amoeba-like creature, which no development studio would have ever been able to deliver on. And it was blown up to that level partially because of the actions of CD Projekt Red. This game was in the public eye for so long that things that were thrown out casually in 2014 and 15 as potential features were taken as promises of future gameplay mechanics that players could expect at launch. And I mean, there were also just like, you know, straight up lies and stuff.
If we suck somewhere, it's on us. It's nobody else to blame.
The company, at the very least, needs to get the game into a decent working condition. In other words, the state it should have been at launch when they were charging people $60 for it. But trust me, this is just the beginning. In the critique, we're going into all of this in great detail. Buckle up, subscribe, it'll be out soon. But that's it for me. Thanks for watching. I love you. Follow my Twitch, Twitter, all that stuff.